Do you want to start the recording?
Recording in progress.
Good evening and welcome everybody to the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Board of Directors meeting on Wednesday, February 8th. And this is, I think, our last teleconference. What am I going to say? Hybrid kind of meeting this way. And so if you take a look at the agenda, you will see that members of the board are able to attend remotely, as well as members of the public. You'll also see some notes about speaking limits. And with that, I will like to go to call to order.
Thank you. And I will begin with you, Chair Tyson.
Here.
Vice Chair Walia.
Here.
Director Scozola.
Here.
Mohan.
Here.
Moore.
Here.
Mekachek.
Present.
Martinez Beltran.
Here.
Showalter.
Here.
Klein.
Here.
And participating remotely, Director Hilton.
Here.
Director Chua.
Here.
Director Lee.
Present.
Thank you. And Director Meadows.
Present.
Excellent. All are present. We have a quorum.
Excellent. A full house. Let's move on to public comment, and the public is able to speak on items that are within our subject matter jurisdiction. And do we have any public, the members of the public that wish to speak? I do not see any in the room. Do we have any online?
No hands raised, Chair.
All right, very good. In that case, we'll move on to the consent calendar. And let me ask first for a motion on approving consent.
Move to approve consent calendar.
Second by Klein.
Take comment. Don't worry. With that, do we have any comments from the members of the board regarding items on the consent calendar? I do not see any here. I do not see any online. With that, I'm going to switch to the members of the public. If any members of the public wish to speak regarding our consent calendar. I do not see any here in person. Do we have any online?
No.
We do not. In that case, let's go for a roll call vote.
Thank you. Chair Tyson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Walia.
Yes.
Scozola.
Yes.
Mohan.
Yes.
Moore.
Yes.
Martinez Beltran.
Aye.
Showalter.
Yes.
Klein.
Aye.
Hilton.
Aye.
Meadows.
Aye.
Chua.
Aye.
Lee. Thank you, Director Lee. That was an affirmative vote. And Mekachek?
Aye.
Thank you. And that motion carries.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the regular calendar, which is item number 2, and that's the CEO report.
Thank you, Chair Tyson, members of the board. I have 5 items to update you on, and we'll start with showing you a few slides. So we're going to start with our GHG emissions inventory from 2021. And when it comes down to it, we have a mission to reduce emissions, by providing clean electricity, innovative programs, and doing that at affordable rates. So this is something we do each year, and we provide this to you. So I think this year we'll show this to you. I think the board, all of us need to be looking at this a few times a year, kind of anchor us back to our mission and how we are doing. So you'll see the leftmost bar is the emission amount from prior to SVCE, which is about 4 million tons of CO2. And when SVCE was created, if you look at the bottom right of your slide, the little legend there tells you what the goals that were set for GHG reduction targets back in 2016 and 17, just as we were forming. So the first board set this at 30% below 2015, which is our baseline, 40% by 25, 50% by 2030. Very ambitious. Now going back to the bar chart itself, you'll see from 2017 onwards, we've seen a reduction in emissions. And if you look at the bar, the extreme left bar, and the bar just next to it, you'll see that the green part of the bar is what becomes smaller, and that's electricity. So it's the electricity emissions associated with electricity, which basically got us that 14%. And in 2017, we only had a partial year of service at SVCE. We started in April 2017. So it's almost like, I'd like to compare 2015 to 2018. So there's almost like a 21% reduction due to electricity emissions. There still is there still are some electricity emissions left. The bottom part of that bar, which has the green, that has to do with direct access customers who have a different carbon profile. So now I'll take you to 2020 and 21. You'll see in 2020, emissions got down quite a bit to 35% versus the baseline year of 2015. And that's a lot of it has to do with COVID. And in 2021, it came back because we've had a partially normal year. 2022 will also have COVID impacts. So this is for your information only at this time and awareness. We'll just flash one more slide. I think we have one more slide on this. Yeah. And we'll provide this to you after, this is actually in the CEO report. So you'll see this as to the reasons why emissions have changed by each different subsector that we have in that bar graph. Any questions on this or comments? Yes, Director Beltran.
What do we anticipate for 2022 as far as the jump? The slide's not there anymore, but it went, I think, from 35 down to 29.
Yeah, I don't know yet. No, I don't have an idea. So I can talk to staff and see if someone has a better sense of it. It takes us some time to collect the data. So we collect data from all the cities, and then on the transportation data, we have to go to the MTC to collect that data. And this year it took us quite a bit of time to get all the data back. Typically, we'll have 2022 numbers in fall. So late fall of 2023 is when you'll see the 2022 update.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Director Mohan?
You said that that COVID had an impact on numbers for 2020 and 2021, I believe. Or yeah.
Yes.
So how exactly did that impact this?
So if you go to the next slide, if you look at 2020 compared to 2021, it's the vehicle miles traveled. So just because people were sheltering in place, we just had that much less transportation emissions. So that's pretty much the major change.
Thank you.
Actually, if we have anyone on our staff who is on Zoom who knows that, has a sense of the answer to Director Martinez Beltran's question, feel free to speak up. I think Rebecca may be on the call.
Rebecca, I've unmuted you.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good evening, board. Happy to answer this question. So with regard to the shelter-in-place impacts for 2020, across our territory, I believe BMT was around 75% lower than, 75% of normal, say, 2019 level. In 2021, we saw about an 85% BMT compared to normal. So that was about a 10 to 12% increase in BMT between the 2 years.
I think Director Klein has a question.
Yes, as far as the residential gas consumption emissions, I think that went down both during COVID and basically during the last 2 years and pre-COVID. Are we attributing that specifically to programs that we've instituted to move from gas to electric appliances, water heaters, all that? That to me seemed, I'm happy to see that number. That seemed to be surprising to see a 3% drop year over year continuing. Does staff have any feel for gas consumption?
Going to ask Rebecca if she has any thoughts on that.
Sure. So you might notice for both the residential and non-residential gas consumption, the levels have been pretty consistent over the years. One thing to note is that this energy consumption has not been normalized for weather. So some of the variation that you see in the bars could be due to, colder winters in certain years. So I'd say as far as COVID impacts go, though, the non-residential sector has been impacted the most in terms of gas consumption, and we've seen residential gas remain relatively consistent, weather considered.
Okay, just wondering. Okay, thank you.
And also say, and this, we have it on the second slide, the precision of some of these estimates, it's only going to improve as we go in the future. On the electric side, it's easier to measure when it comes to this, and especially when you look at these, what's left, say if we go back one slide, Andrea, what's left here, it is extremely difficult to reduce this. SVCEA has a part to play in it, but there's a lot in these emissions that are out of our control, which is what we'll be coming back to you with this year on different strategies on where we can influence, where we can get the market to work, etc. But this, when we look at 2030, 2045 is when the state has a goal for carbon neutrality of the grid, and we have other CARB emission reduction targets. There's going to be a lot more we have to do on GHG emissions modeling. So we've started that work already. If I may move on to the second topic I have here as an update, and this is just, I want to share my thoughts a little early on strategic focus areas. These are high-level priorities. It's more of a snapshot of priorities that the board has approved when you approved the budget and you approved the strategic plan last year. In looking at this and looking out a couple of years, my thinking is it's not really going to change. Each of these areas, whether reading from right to left, employees, finance, Inflation Reduction Act, focusing on electrification, and looking and investigating 24/7 clean energy, they're all multiple year projects. And so my thinking at this point is to keep them as is. When we come back to you in the May timeframe talking about our next year's budget, we do our budget and our strategic plan kind of in parallel. So this is my thinking right now. Of course, I'll be talking to the Finance Committee, Executive Committee, and to you also. So there's more sharing my thoughts and awareness. I'm not asking you for your approval right now. The next topic is Andrea is going to look at our website and share with you an example of our community impact report. Obviously, the entire team of the board, communities, our staff, we're very proud of all the accomplishments we've made. And so we are sending emails to the board, all the council members, all the city managers with this community impact report. So let's click on Los Altos Hills. Let's see, the chairs. So it's a 2-page PDF. So we'll be sending it. It's a high level of what the emission reductions are for your particular city. In the bottom left of this, it's what the impacts are for all the communities in SVCE. And on the right-hand side, it's also our emissions factors comparison, which shows that we are very low compared to PG&E and the California grid average. So let's enjoy this for this year, especially that emission reduction factor. Ours is going to go up due to a technicality with a geothermal project that it'll go up a little bit. Okay, so the next item is, I'd like to update you on, I've updated you on this at the last board meeting, which is this concept of buying capacity to maintain reliability. The CPUC provides basically a prescription or an order of what we have to purchase. In spite of our best efforts, we weren't able to purchase all the megawatts that we needed to purchase. Due to a very tight market, we put out multiple RFPs and did not get responses to them. Our costs for this capacity, which we call resource adequacy or RA, is multiple times what we used to pay for this a few years ago. So we will be penalized by the PUC, and we haven't received the citations yet. I just wanted to inform you about it. We will take a hit on our finances, and I believe there'll be at least 10 other CCAs in the same boat. So it's not for lack of trying, but as Monica and Charles will explain in item 5 about reliability and capacity and how tight the market is today, and how we are transitioning from a fossil fuel grid to a very green grid. These are the kinds of things that are changing, where just the regulations are tightening up, capacity is very tight. So this is, again, for your awareness. We'll have more information for you once we get information from the CPUC. The last item is just FYI, there was a order from the CPUC that came out in January. Actually, it's the proposed decision. The CPUC hasn't adopted it yet, to purchase 4,000 megawatts of clean energy by the years 2027 and 2028. So that's a new procurement order that if the PUC adopts, we'll have to buy more clean electricity by a date certain. Also in January, the federal government completed leasing about 380,000 acres of ocean space off Morro Bay and Humboldt. And that was to develop about 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And so that's a big deal. They got about $800 million in lease revenues, which works out about $0.05 a square foot of what they were leasing the ocean space for. They expect it to come in between 2030 and 2035 as to when they have the first megawatts of offshore wind coming in. So there's lots of progress being made at scale on this, as you can see, whether it's ordering procurement for the next few years or really looking at the future of how we're going to be developing new renewable sources. So with that, I'll end my report, open for any questions from the board.
Yes, let's do that in a sec. don't see any questions here. Do we have any online?
No hands raised, Chair.
Okay. We had a Rebecca hand raised a few minutes ago. I don't know if that's still.
No.
Okay. Go ahead. Director
So as
Klein.
far as the penalty from the PUC and the 10, supposedly 10 other CCAs are also having that issue, is this, from a timeliness standpoint, when will we hear that? How, and I understand there's other agencies that are under the same issue, but is this an ongoing, do we think this is going to be an ongoing issue that's from a requirement standpoint that we will have difficulty meeting? Is this something that we should be advocating with, at the state level, trying to figure out a way out of this? Because if this is something that few CCAs are actually able to meet, then this is just putting us into a penalty zone.
Yeah, I think your concerns are shared by all of us at SVCE and the broader CCA community. And the whole regime of how they measure capacity is going to change in 2025. Mm-hmm. However, there are many things the CPUC can do to improve this process, and we have made regulatory filings suggesting those changes. Our state association, Cal CCA, has also made several recommendations. So we will approach our legislators also to keep them informed as to the state of this capacity market. I think it's just going to be rocky for a few years. I feel very optimistic about the future. The state's going through a giant change, going from this 100-year-old fossil fuel grid to a clean grid in a very short period of time. And frankly, the regulators don't know all the rubrics on how to measure reliability well. And so we do have definite complaints about the methods that they use, and sometimes these penalties, it's kind of like the whippings will continue till morale improves. It's when there isn't any capacity there, I don't know what you're supposed to do about it. We also have concerns about where the money goes, as it goes to the state general fund versus it goes back to maybe something that helps with reliability. So yeah, these are just some of the issues that we have, and we are advocating at San Francisco and Sacramento on this.
So I appreciate that. Just from a capacity standpoint, is the way this is set up is, do we need to continue to put out the RFPs because we'll be, the way things are, fined a year from now in exactly the same way, is my question.
We could be.
Okay.
Yes.
So we continue to put out RFPs trying to meet our capacity requirements
Right.
from a CPU standpoint.
It is possible. So actually, this kind of gets set up a little bit. I think some of your questions would be very relevant in item 5, actually, because we're going to give you a presentation on reliability. And there may be some ways to, we've adopted a strategy of buying capacity short term.
Okay.
And we may want to look at buying some of our capacity long term. And I think that may lower the chances of penalties.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Showalter, I believe, has a question.
Yes, I'm a newbie, and so everybody else may know this, but I was wondering, are there efforts around the state to increase the capacity? Because of course, or generally, what are those big efforts, and should we how can we advocate for them? Because obviously, as we electrify, we're going to need more electricity, right?
Yeah, and I think I'd be happy to give a short answer on item 5. This is what we'll be talking about. So yes, there's a lot of capacity that has been ordered for us to build. Just since 2019, there's been about orders to build almost 14,500 megawatts. Just to give you a sense of scale, our peak load is about 900 megawatts. So PUC has ordered about 14,500. The order in January is another 4,000. When you look out through 2045, there's 180,000 megawatts of capacity that needs to be built. So there's many, many billions of dollars worth of capacity that needs to be built. So the PUC wants it built, the system operator wants it built, the governor wants it built, the legislature wants it built. It's the transition that we are going to have issues with. We just have to, that's why I say I'm very optimistic about the future. It's this period of time that we are transitioning that we have some issues, because at the same time, we have a schedule to shut down natural gas plants also. So we'll talk about that more on item 5.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any more comments or questions here. How about from online? I don't see any hands raised. Do we have any public that wishes to comment on this item? Looking around, I do not see any here in person and online.
No hands raised, Chair.
Then we'll say thank you to Girish for the report. Some cautionary things going on, huh? So appreciate that. That was for information only. I would like to see if I can step back. I've had a request from Director Mekachuk to change his vote to abstain for item on the consent item of 1F, and procedurally, I don't know how hard that is to do. He has a professional reason for choosing to be noting an abstention vote on 1F.
Okay, thank you. And if I could just check with General Counsel if we will need to redo our total vote, or if I could just note that in the minutes.
Yes, I would suggest that we redo the vote, and that if there's an abstention, that they leave from the room during that particular vote to make sure that that is clear that there's an abstention there.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you, Lindsay. Let's go ahead and repeat that vote then. Can we repeat the motion and second?
Yes.
Or we could start over.
Just one moment, let me pull that up. Alrighty. And the motion was made by Director Martinez-Beltran, seconded by Director Klein.
Are you okay with just doing that again?
Sure.
Yes, I am.
I'm getting an affirmation, so let's go ahead with the vote.
Thanks so much. I'll start with you, Chair Tyson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Walia?
Yes.
Scozola?
Yes.
Mohan?
Yes.
Moore?
Yes.
Martinez-Beltran?
Aye.
Showalter?
Yes.
Klein?
Aye.
Hilton?
Aye.
Meadows?
Yes.
Chua?
I,
Lee?
Aye.
Thank you, and that carries. I will note there is an abstention vote for item 1F from Director Mekachuk.
Okay, he just stepped out. I want to get a head nod. You're just showing him as an abstention for just 1F?
Is that correct?
Please,
Director?
can you just confirm your vote?
I'm confirming my vote as an abstention on 1F, and I vote aye for the rest.
All right.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. In that case, let's move on to item number 3, and that is to appoint the 20.
One more.
Yes?
One more comment on that. If there's a particular reason for the abstention, if you can note what that is, if there was a conflict or just deciding to abstain for personal.
So I'm on the audit committee, and I feel a professional conflict there on voting on a transaction of which Monte Sereno has an interest in, and my professional ethics as a CPA require me to do that. So that's my reasoning.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, then let's move on again to item number 3, which is appointing the board committee members. And Andrea.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I am very excited to bring this item to you. It is to appoint our remaining committees. So if you may recall, last month we did appoint members to our executive committee, and so this is for those remaining committees that we have. I will go ahead and share with you who I heard interest from each of these groups. For our 2023 Legislative Ad Hoc Committee, this can be made up of 6 members, and they will focus on 6 policy areas that were approved when this ad hoc committee was formed. I heard from Director Elliot Scozola, Zach Hilton, Brian Mekachek, Yvonne Martinez Beltran, and Margaret Abakoga, that they would be interested in serving in this group. For our Finance and Administration Committee, again, this can be made up of up to 6 members. I heard from Elliot Scozola, Hung Wei, Sally Meadows, Margaret Abakoga, and Tina Walia. And for our Audit Committee, who meets to kick off and receive our audit and IT audit, financial and IT, I heard from Alternate Director Sergio Lopez, Sheila Mohan, Brian Mekachek, Murali Srinivasan, and Harjat Sangha from Gilroy, who was nominated by Director Zach Hilton. And again, this group can also be made of up to 6 members. And that concludes my report.
Thank you for that report. So we have 3 committees, and they each have 5 people who have expressed interest, and I want to thank all of them for stepping up to help us with our operations. Do we have any board members here who wish to nominate any additional candidates for any of those 3 committees? Director Klein.
Yes, I would like to add my name to the Legislation Ad Hoc Committee. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any others? I do not see any here. Do we have any, I don't see any, I guess there's only 2 online, so I can see both of your faces already. So if you were raising your hand, I'd probably have an idea of that. All right, very good. In that case, I think we have a complete slate. Let's go for public comment. Do we have any of the members of the public that wish to comment on any of these committees? I do not see any here in person, nor do we have any online.
No hands raised.
So I would again like to express my thanks to all of those of you who have stepped up, and let's proceed with the roll call vote.
Could we have a motion?
Oh, we need a motion. Yeah, that's right.
So moved.
Second.
Who was the second?
Second,
All right.
Martinez Beltran.
So we have a motion and a second. Let's proceed then with that vote.
Yes, thank you. Chair Tyson,
Yes.
Vice Chair Walia,
Aye.
Director Scozola,
Aye.
Mohan,
Yes.
Moore,
Yes.
Mekachek,
Aye.
Martinez Beltran,
Aye.
Showalter,
Yes.
Klein,
Aye.
Hilton,
Aye.
Meadows,
Yes.
Chua,
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Thank you, and that motion carries.
Great. Thanks again to everybody. Let's move on to item number 4, which is new construction reach code recap, and I believe that's Zoe coming to the front here. Lay some good news on us, Zoe.
Good evening. Yes, I am lucky to be here with the good news. And I was just realizing this marks about 1 year anniversary of when we kicked off this initiative. Dawn and I came and met with each of you, and it was exactly 1 year ago because we did those in January and February. So really excited to get to be here with you all and really to celebrate your good work. Tony is here in the room as well. Tony, myself, and Peter Mustachich had the great honor of working with you all, every single one of your jurisdictions and your staff and community members on electrification reach codes in the past year, and have made great progress. So I'm going to give you the final status update. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Yep, so it's a recap, and then we're going to talk really briefly at the end what comes next. So 13 out of 13 jurisdictions. That was the target that we set, fingers crossed, and we reached that milestone. It's really exciting. And not just that, but 5 of you went even further than you did last year, or in the last code cycle, rather. So again, really big moves. We see those marked with the orange arrows. Campbell going all electric for all of their buildings, went from a more modified code. Gilroy increasing the EVCI requirements. The EV code was the first time that they participated and adopted a code in this code cycle. Really exciting. Milpitas, they were the ones, if you have been here for all of the meetings, they adopted just in January, so our most recent, and they moved from an electric preferred to all electric. Monte Sereno also moved from electric preferred to mostly electric. And Morgan Hill adopted additional EVI requirements this code cycle. So great continued effort, exciting. Next. This is about what I just said before, but I want to just make this point again. 8 of our jurisdictions adopted all electric reach codes, and 11 adopted an EV code. So really, really exciting and impressive. And then you can see 2 of the jurisdictions, Mountain View and Santa Clara, also had additional PV or solar requirements, an additional innovation that was beyond kind of even what we had proposed, but really made sense for their particular communities. And this is simply just another way to get the picture of how the codes compare to each other. You can see again, that big blue bubble is the EV codes, and those 8 all-electric codes. So congratulations, right? You all do so much work, and so much has gone into this, and so it's really, I think, important to be able to celebrate these milestones. There's going to be a lot of construction, as you all know, happening in our region over the next 8 years. And what we can celebrate is that that construction is going to add to clean energy. It's going to reduce pollution, both in terms of carbon pollution, but also hazardous NOx pollution in your jurisdictions. And all of this, these buildings are going to be future ready with EV charging. So really exciting for all of us here, but really for your communities and future residents of our region. This also means that all of our jurisdictions are eligible. Many of you have already received your $10,000 in support and recognition of that staff effort that went into this. We also are sending certificates of appreciation to all of our building officials and staff. If you see them in the halls, please do also congratulate them and thank them. They all put in a lot of work on top of really busy schedules. And then my final note is that we just look forward to continuing to work with you all in the next year and your community members as we move to upgrading existing building stock to become cleaner, modern, and more efficient, as well as transportation. So this is my last presentation on new construction reach codes, but don't worry, I will be back and meeting with each of you individually and all of your staff members in the coming months to talk about how we can support your efforts around existing buildings. That's my presentation. If there's questions, I'm happy to answer any of it.
Thank you, Zoe. Do we have any questions or comments? Director Mekachuk?
Thank you. I wanted to say that the City of Monte Sereno, our sticking point, the only natural gas that we allowed inside of the house was for a cooktop. And it's difficult to believe that an induction cooktop stands in the way of us being all electric. And we're going to really promote induction cooktops so that we're looking to an all-electric code in the next cycle. So I want to compliment staff on all the hard work in making this happen. Thank you.
Wonderful and exciting, and I know our marketing communications team would be happy to help support efforts on communication engagement around induction cooking. It's also something we're excited to do.
Great, thank you. Director Showalter?
Yes, just a comment. I wanted to say that in addition to our staff, who have done a tremendous amount of work on this over the years, it hasn't been a short process, really. I remember talking about it the first time in, I think it was 2017. But we really owe a great deal of thanks to Carbon Free Mountain View and Carbon Free Silicon Valley for their leadership and advocacy. And Bruce Carney is here in person, and at least in Mountain View, it would not have happened without them. So thank you.
Great, thanks for those comments. Any others here on the dais? I don't see any online. Let's hear from the public. Do we have any public comments? I do not see any here. And then online, we do not. So I will like to repeat the expression of thanks to all of the cities, and then also to you and your team, Zoe, and Tony and Peter. And now we move on to the next stage.
That's right. Thank you all.
Thank you. And then let's move on then to item number 5, which is the previously mentioned and much anticipated reliability challenges, opportunities, and strategies. And is that Chief Operating Officer Monica going to be speaking?
Well, it's actually, is this on? Yeah, it's a tag team effort. I think Garisha's going to start us off, and then it'll be me and Charles Grinstead, Senior Manager of Power Resources.
Great.
Chair Tyson, members of the board. So I'm taking a big risk right now to say what I'm going to say, because this could fall really flat. But let's have some fun on this one. It's a serious topic, actually. So what you're going to hear about is this topic on capacity. Our industry is kind of weird. We think we're buying electricity, but electricity is made up of so many different products. There's capacity. And within capacity, there's actually a bunch of capacity products. Then there's energy. There's a bunch of energy products. Then we talk about reliability, which is a combination of capacity and energy. So it is a complicated business. We want to try, I'm going to try a metaphor, because the key point that Monica and Charles are going to talk about is capacity and reliability. Okay, so here goes. Imagine that all of you in 2019, you were thinking about Santa Clara County Health. And you're thinking, how many hospitals should we have in Santa Clara County, and how many hospital beds should we have in Santa Clara County? All of you elected officials, these are the things you think about. And you think, well, it depends. How many sick people do we normally have? What's the population going to be in the next few years? What are the demographics of this population? And based on that, you figure out, here are the number of hospitals and hospital beds you need to have. And you need to make sure you have enough for a kind of worst case. So you may say, I need to have about 50,000 beds. Even if I think on average I may only be using 25,000, but there are cases that may happen. So you need to have enough capacity in the system that can handle these shocks to the system. And it's some kind of balance between cost also comes in, because you don't have unlimited money this time. So capacity, in a way, is very similar. Capacity on hospital beds is very similar to what we have in our energy business, about how many power plants should just be built and available to turn on at any time. Okay, so going back to hospitals, remember I told you're in 2019, right? You did a great job. You set up the number of beds. 2019 went off great. Now you're in 2020. How did that go? You just said, oh boy, my forecast was off, right? That's kind of what we're going through in the electric system when it comes to climate change. Last year in September, we had a heat storm. We call it a 1 in 40-year heat storm. Our system's planned for 1 in 10 years. It's kind of like COVID. The whole hospitals and number of beds were planned for based on certain assumptions. Well, those assumptions just got exploded, right? So similarly, over here on the electric side, heat waves are a big deal. So that's what the CPUC, CARB, the state, we're looking out in the future and saying, how much capacity do we need to keep the lights on? All right, so now I'm going to add one more level of complication on this to make the metaphor kind of work. Let's say we had 100 hospitals in Santa Clara County with those 50,000 beds. And you all were told, you discovered, that about 60 of those hospitals have a bunch of rooms in them with lead paint and asbestos. So you're basically going to you have a plan to get rid of them. You can't get rid of all of them right away. So you come up with a schedule saying, all right, these are the hospitals that I'm going to get rid of. The metaphor on the electric side is fossil fuel plants. We know those are going out. But given suddenly COVID's come up, oh boy, do we shut this plant down because we need more beds? So that's the trade-off. So we need to have enough capacity. You as health officials want to make sure you have enough capacity in the system to withstand shocks. We may go through, in this case, the next 5 years, you as health officials, where we don't have COVID surges. And you've built a few of these hospitals. All right? That's kind of where we are with capacity. So I just want to bring that up from a kind of more story kind of basis, that capacity is what we have to almost rent. We need to keep these hospitals just alive. How they get used, that just happens day to day. We don't know how, but we need to have it available. So it's a complicated issue on the electric system, but I wanted to try that out with you. So as we go through this presentation, we want to make sure that concept kind of sticks on capacity. All right, so I'll take my reviews later on, whether that fell flat or not. I'll hand it over to Monica to do the actual presentation.
Well, at least he didn't talk about death, because we think about death and capacity and reliability in the same time. So good evening, energy officials, not hospital officials. So most of the time when I come to talk to you, I come to talk about clean electricity, very rarely about reliability. We can go to the next slide. So, so tonight we're here to talk about, really to give you the foundation of reliability in California and some of the challenges facing California. And Girish mentioned some of the longer term challenges and some of the short term real hardships that we're facing at SVCE in terms of meeting reliability or resource adequacy requirements. We've also, we've done a lot and we continue to do a lot of procurement, mostly for the benefit of meeting our clean energy policies. And sometimes that comes with reliability resources and sometimes it doesn't. So we need to rethink how we procure resources in the future to meet our reliability objectives and requirements. So we'll talk a little bit about that, including some things that we never thought we were going to think about before. As a clean CCA, we never really anticipated, like, how does fossil fuel or those asbestos-laden hospitals play a role in meeting our objectives long term? So that's what we hope to talk about. Again, it's going to be myself and Charles Grinstead. Feel free to ask us questions at any time. This is a somewhat complicated topic, but not that complicated, and we're happy to take questions at any point. Next slide. Just at a very, very high level, these are the big drivers that the state has kind of put in place that drive what we buy and when we need to buy it by. So to start, AB 32, which most of you are familiar with, these are the greenhouse gas reduction targets that were set. For the electricity sector in California, we essentially have to go back down to 1990 levels, or at least 80% reduction of 1990 levels by 2050. So that's our overarching goal. The state also has adopted through legislation a renewable portfolio standard of 60% by 2030. And through the integrated resource plan that the board adopted back in October, November, you actually set that target for SVCEA at 65%. And then through SB 100, the state has adopted a clean electricity target of 100% by 2045. And as you know, SVCE is 100% clean energy CCA, and we've achieved that since we started back in 2018 or 2017. So these are the targets. The state tracks our progress through these targets, and tracks how we plan to achieve these targets through a process called the Integrated Resource Plan. Again, this is something that you guys all saw back in October, November, where we said this is how we think we're going to meet our share of these objectives. Next slide. So as Girish mentioned, the California power fleet is in transition. In order to get to that 2045 100% clean electricity, we have to do a lot. And so right now, if we put ourselves kind of in the past present place, we have 80,000 megawatts of capacity currently online, and that's a mix of all kinds of fossil fuels, including natural gas, hydro, nuclear, some solar, some wind, some storage, not a whole lot, and then some geothermal. And as we move through time, next slide, there's going to have to be a whole bunch of changes in order to get to that future state again. So in the middle bubble there, where we call present, just a couple of things to note. To get to that future, the state has identified the need to retire several fossil fuel resources, including a bunch of ones through cooling units that are located along the coast in California. Those units have been slated to shut down by 2022, I think originally 2021, but keep getting extended because they are needed for reliability purposes. We have made efforts to convert the fleet, just not at the rate that's necessary. So at present, we've collectively, as a state, brought on 8,000 megawatts of clean energy resources. Next slide. But we need 180,000 megawatts of clean new capacity to get to that 2045 goal. So we're currently at 80,000. We brought on about 8,000 clean megawatts of capacity, but we need to get to 180,000. And that's going to be met by all the things that we've already done, but we're going to have to do some new things, like looking at offshore wind. And there's an effort by the state to make that a goal for the state. How it gets built and who builds it is still in question. But we're also going to have to look at new technologies as well. And so things like hydrogen or some other, I guess, fusion, whatever that thing is that they did in Livermore, and maybe some small nuclear. But we're going to have to look at everything in order to get to that clean grid that we're planning for in 2045. Next slide. So Girish mentioned the heat storm or heat wave that happened in 2022. And this here is just a kind of, we went from a very big picture, what's going to happen in 2045 to what happened on September 6, 2022. And this illustrates very much how important every single megawatt of capacity or resources that are online played a part in meeting our requirements on that day in September 6, 2022. So if you look at the chart there, you have the time of the day, starting at midnight or 1 in the morning all the way through midnight, and the different resources that came online every hour of the day, and everything was coming online. We had demand response, we had backup generation. Load started to pick up when the heat started to pick up, and then between the hours of about 4 or 5 p.m. onward, that's when we saw, the biggest problem, and that's when we all heard the signal that we had to cut our electricity use or demand response. But what you can see here is how much fossil fuel or natural gas resources came online during those hours. That's the teal line all the way at the top. And then you can also see what happened to renewables or clean resources about that same time. They started to taper down as the sun set, and I guess there just wasn't a whole lot of wind that day anyway. So you can see there that this illustrates, like Girish said, a 1 in 40 event, not a likely event. We don't even plan for 1 in 40 events. I think we plan for a 1 in 10. Yeah, so not even close to this. But this is the type of reliability issues that the state is now considering. Should we plan for these types of events? And if we do plan for these types of events, how will the resources, the clean resources, behave when we get into these types of events? Next slide. So what is reliability? We tend to think of reliability, the way that we look at it is kind of meeting an obligation that the state has put in front of us. But just at a really high level, the things that you want to look at is capacity and just, capacity is the amount of electricity a power plant can produce at its maximum output, and it's usually measured in megawatts or gigawatts or kilowatts. So it just represents, like Girish said, how many hospitals you need in the county. So what's the maximum capacity you need? And then energy is a measurement of electricity generated over a period of time, and it's usually expressed in megawatt hours. The combination of those two is essentially how reliable you are, how much capacity and energy how much capacity you have, and how much energy you can generate over the periods of time that you need it. So that's what kind of reliability is in California, or just in general. Next slide. And so each resource collectively contributes a different level of reliability to the grid. And here you can see how, different resources, so we have, natural gas resources, geothermal, wind, solar, and solar plus storage. And they, over the course of a day, so the x-axis here is, hours again, they produce electricity at a different rate. They're very much dependent on the fuel source. So the wind has to blow, or the sun has to shine, or the natural gas has to be available to source these power plants. And so as we're adding more and more clean resources and retiring more of those fossil fuel resources, this ability to predict how much capacity we're going to have in every hour to meet reliability becomes much, much more difficult for the state to accomplish. Next slide. So you can see up here again, there's that variation where the clean resources are going to vary throughout the day, and the fossil fuel resources will continue to stay constant, but just in total, the megawatts available will be less. And I just want to highlight here that storage is one way that we can help push out energy or clean energy capacity into other hours that we need it. But you need a lot of storage capacity in order to do that, and Charles will talk a little bit about that later. Next slide. So, just the difference between energy and capacity. So when we talk about energy here at SVCE, we always think of it in terms of, our clean goals. Are we 100% clean? Are we clean? What's our RPS? Those are our energy measurements. Again, we measure it on an annual basis, whether we've procured enough clean resources, whether they're renewable portfolio standard resources, that's solar, wind, geothermal, or non-RPS resource such as hydro and nuclear, to meet 100% of our energy load on an annual basis. So that's important to note. We talk about that all the time. That's one concept. When we bring resources to you, the board, or we procure them or contract for them, we can buy two different types of products. We can buy them together or unbundled, and that's energy and capacity. A lot of times when we talk about reliability, we buy what we call capacity-only products. And so those capacity-only products basically allow us to rent or claim the capacity from a unit so that if the grid needs it, it'll turn on. But we don't get any energy from it. We just get the counting rights. And so we have to buy these types of resources to meet our resource adequacy requirement. Like Girish mentioned earlier, in 23, we fell short of meeting that requirement. We didn't buy enough capacity resource to meet our requirements under the state's resource adequacy program, which is what they use for reliability, to measure reliability. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Charles, unless you guys have any questions about the difference between capacity and energy and how each resource kind of meets those two requirements. All right, then Charles.
Thanks, Monica. Is my microphone on?
No,
Morning, or good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? No, not yet.
you know how to turn it on?
There we go. Can everyone hear me now? Great. Good evening, everyone. As Monica mentioned, I'll be talking about our portfolio and objectives and progress. Next slide, please. So we want to give a brief overview of the different types of products and strategies that we employ here at SVCE. So we must procure electricity products to meet mandates and board directives. So we've split apart our two different sort of overarching strategies with buying energy. So the first being that we just buy energy products and then also capacity. And so we're driven by certain goals or requirements in these two different procurement buckets. So for energy, we're driven by meeting 100% clean. So all of the energy that is served to our customers is either a renewable or carbon-free resource. We also have the renewable portfolio standard. So on an annual basis, we are measuring our portfolio and the energy that we serve to our customers. A certain percentage of that has to be renewable. And then we also have reliability procurement mandates. So these are sort of requirements that are set forth for us to go out and procure certain types of capacity so that we ensure that we have a reliable grid. So what we buy, typically we've purchased hydro, solar plus storage, geothermal, and wind, and then how we buy it. So a lot of our resources are long-term resources in terms of term, so 10 to 15 years, sometimes 20, but we purchase those through what's called a power purchase agreement. And so that's bundled of all types of different attributes, energy, capacity, and also renewable energy credits. But we also purchase short-term resources. So sometimes short-term hydro from the Pacific Northwest, also renewable energy credits. We make those purchases. Sometimes those are 1 to 3 years. And so here in the capacity bucket, as Monica mentioned, we're really driven to meet our RA requirements and also reliability procurement mandates. So not only do they measure the energy that's required for new capacity resources, but also their capacity benefit. And so, the resources that we typically buy there are natural gas, solar, geothermal, and wind, and also storage. So how we buy it, again, it's the PPAs, so bundled of energy and capacity and renewable credits. And then also we purchase a lot of short-term RA capacity only products to meet our requirements, since we are building our portfolio slowly over time. A lot of those short-term only capacity products are natural gas. So natural gas remains as the primary source of the market to go out and fill those products and meet our requirements. I just want to maybe pause there for a question. Yes, Director Vaughn.
I just wanted to, so I'm imagining that you are not securing the long-term power purchase because you can't, because there's not enough available, and so therefore you're using the short-term RE for your capacity. Is that? Oh, is it pricing? Is it availability?
Well, it's for capacity. Garish is actually capped at 5 years, and so we don't tend to go out in the market and buy long-term capacity. We haven't. We can, but we haven't. We do it in the form, when we do these long-term power purchase agreements that the board approves. Again, those have energy and capacity, so we do get long-term capacity from that source. But generally, we've liked to, for risk management purposes, we like to have a combination of short-term and long-term products in our portfolio. It helps us better meet our changes in our load should we have load depart, or sometimes we have load increase and we need to go out and fill those holes. And sometimes the requirements change and we need to adjust for those changes as well. So just from a practical standpoint, a combination of both is very useful.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we can move on to the next slide. So we just want to kind of orient ourselves with what we're working with here at SVC in terms of load. So energy and capacity or demand. So SVC accounts for about 2.5% of the total CAISO load. So on an annual basis, we're looking at about 4 million megawatt hours of energy served to our customers. And the shape of that profile over the course of a year looks like this. And as we mentioned before, we're driven to meet 100% clean energy, so a combination of renewables and carbon-free resources. To give a sense of what that looks like in terms of peak demand, on average in the summer we peak at about 825 megawatts, and this is a number that we use to plan for reliability. So we submit this forecast and you layer on a planning reserve margin and you develop an RA requirement. And so we submit this information, it becomes a part of our planning requirements, and then we go out and procure capacity to meet these peak demand scenarios. Next slide, please. So talking just a little bit about load and the clean resources that we go out and procure. So SVC provides 100% clean energy on an annual basis through renewable portfolio standard products, so RECs, and carbon-free and non-RPS resources. So just to give a sense of where we're headed and where we are now, so in this chart here at the bottom, the bar charts here are RPS in green and then carbon-free in blue. And so currently, we serve our portfolio with about 54% of renewables, and then the rest is carbon-free. In 2045, we are headed towards 75% renewables, and then also 25% carbon-free. So we have these policies to get to 65%, though we anticipate that carbon-free, the resources that make up that are hydro, they may be a little more difficult to source. So we anticipate having more renewables in our portfolio. So the important things to take away here is that the RPS goal is to get to 65% in 2030 and then 75% in 2045. So we have ambitious goals, though we think they're manageable, and that's what our plan is. And so to give a sense of what we're building, we have this chart over here to the right. And so it's a combination of solar and storage, solar, geothermal, wind, the voluntary allocation market offer, which is a mechanism in which RPS has been transferred from PG&E's portfolio to ours, and then also procuring short-term RECs. And so you can see that through 2030, we're well on track with planned procurement to meet all of our goals, and then transitioning to 2045, we'll develop those plans and outlay them, but on track so far to reach our targets. Okay. If there's no questions, we can move on to the next slide. So I want to take a second to introduce California's reliability program. So California established a resource adequacy framework, we call it RA, to ensure that each load serving entity has sufficient capacity to meet grid reliability needs. So California has to ensure that there's sufficient capacity to meet monthly peak demand. We also have to plan for adverse weather scenarios. So meeting that peak demand will require a buffer. So we layer on an additional 15%. We call that a planning reserve margin. So we buy capacity above our peak demand with that planning reserve margin. So not every resource or every technology is given the same effectiveness factor. So as Monica had shown in the previous chart, wind has a different profile, solar does as well, and even geothermal is slightly less than natural gas. So when we think about RA, not every technology is equal. So the last point here is, SVC must comply with these RA program requirements, and we make every best effort to go out and procure resources to meet them. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, Director Beltran.
How do we accommodate for, it says plan for an adverse weather scenario, for example, for this past very hot fall that you said. How does that factor in, or how do we look at that?
That number 2 is really a part of number 3. So, we take our peak demand, we look at our actuals, and we say, should we be planning towards 1,000 megawatts like we saw in September of 2022, or should we look at something more normal? So the CEC has a process of looking at our load forecast, assuming some sort of adjustment factors even within that peak forecast. But weather is accounted for in that planning reserve margin. So they understand that there's going to be variances in load throughout every different months and throughout different years. And so that becomes a part of the planning reserve margin buffer. That's where it's sort of captured.
Yeah, so just to maybe, right now, the current framework is that they plan for what they call a 1 in 10 event. So something that might happen every 10 years or a 10% probability event. The thing that happened in September of 2022, again, was a 1 in 40 event. Nobody could, I guess we couldn't really predict that. Charles mentioned that our peak capacity that we planned for is around 825 megawatts. We hit 1,000 megawatts for SVCE that day, that afternoon, or that evening. Yeah. So what, the way that California can adjust to that is they can either increase the planning reserve margin, which they have done for the summer months, and for the investor-owned utilities, they've also increased it, or they can plan for a more adverse condition than a 1 in 10. And I think that's kind of what they're going through right now as well, is to see what is the right type of weather event to model for reliability.
So that is all dependent on the regulations for us. We won't in-house.
No, we don't plan. We don't come up with the rules. We just adhere to them.
Okay.
Try to adhere to them. Thank you.
If there's no other questions, we can move to the next slide. So I just want to kind of give an overview and a look at what we have in our current portfolio. So resource adequacy only capacity products. So in these types of products, they're a little interesting. We want to kind of talk about what they are, since there's a lot of them in our portfolio. So to kind of give an overview of it, the buyer has the rights to capacity under a contract that ensures a resource generates when needed. So like Monica mentioned, we don't always buy the energy associated with resources. Sometimes we just buy the capacity. So these contracts, they really serve to meet the RA program requirements. We buy them, produce contracts, and then file them into filings to the CPUC. And so, primarily these types of contracts are coming from natural gas resources. They're short-term in nature. We're not buying anything longer than 5 years. Most of them are 1 to 3 years in term. But it's really to make sure that those resources are available when needed. We pay them a certain price, and then they show up in the market and perform. So, but the important takeaway here is that there's no energy associated with these types of contracts. Next slide. So just want to give a brief overview of what we currently have in our portfolio and also how our clean resources contribute. So like I mentioned, SVC buys mostly capacity from natural gas resources. The planning reliability with renewables may change. So that may require more capacity and storage resources. So what I mean by that is looking at these two charts, you see that natural gas in 2023 is estimated to make up about 60% of our portfolio. We do have some solar and storage, solar plus storage resources in wind and also geothermal. They only account for about 33% of what our requirements are. And so by 2030, we expect that number to go down, so less reliance on natural gas. However, we still have a long way to go. And just to refresh everyone's memory here, the peak load forecast is on the right, which July, August, and September are the areas of most concern. And so, as we've been kind of talking about tonight, meeting short-term 2023 through 2025 RA capacity requirements is becoming more challenging. And if we can move on to the next slide. So we talk about RA capacity and our resources, and I just want to kind of give a sense of the scale in which we are going out and making these types of procurement for resources. So there is this effectiveness factor that comes into play here, and I want to talk about that for a second. So SVC has over 900 megawatts of capacity from renewables that qualifies for about 408 megawatts of RA capacity. So that effectiveness of those resources is given a haircut towards reliability. So, the typical RA capacity requirement for SVC is about 850 megawatts. And when you take that into consideration with the previous numbers that I had shown, the amount of nameplate capacity that we've actually built is quite significant, but their ability to count for RA gets a pretty big haircut. So 900 megawatts turns into about 400 megawatts for RA. And so, how do we get to 100%? Our estimates are that an additional 2,000 to 2,500 megawatts of nameplate capacity solar plus storage resources are going to be necessary to completely remove gas out of the equation. And so typically the lead time to build new resources is anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So this is not a short-term solution. This is a long planning exercise for SVC. Next slide, please.
I might just want to add one thing is like, there are other resources that we could look at. Of course, wind and geothermal has a really high contribution to resource adequacy, but we're just not seeing those resources readily available in the market. What we are seeing is a lot of offers and projects related to solar and storage. And so that's kind of why we kind of, if we're going to build clean capacity to meet our requirements, it's most likely going to have to come from solar and storage in the near term. Director Beltran.
Are they comparable in price?
Well, yeah.
Being that one's not really available.
That's a difficult question because there's price that these resources are offered to us, and then there's the value that they produce, right? They produce value in terms of energy, clean energy, some reliability, right? And each resource has different value depending on where they're located too, because different parts of the state or the grid have different needs and therefore produce different values. But I think just, we're going through an exercise right now to assessing, like, if we did this, what would it look like in terms of cost to the portfolio versus if we did that. And I think our early estimates are that it's significantly more expensive if we had to meet that clean capacity requirement strictly through clean resources like solar and storage, because of the amount of capacity that we'd have to add and how expensive it is right now in the offers that we're seeing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So looking at this in terms of what happened in September, so we hit that 1,000. Because we currently don't have that capacity, do we just have to start cutting power? Is that our real only recourse at this point?
I'm going to try to answer it, but I'll let Charles step in too. So as a load serving entity, we participate in what's called the California Independent System Operator, or the grid. And so the CalISO has the responsibility to make sure that all of its participants have enough electricity at every moment in time. And so even though we didn't have sufficient capacity lined up through our efforts that we procured for resource adequacy or for any other reason, the grid had to have enough capacity. So they backed us up. And when they back us up, we pay for it, obviously. And so, but that's what the grid does. The grid makes sure that everybody is balanced, regardless if you brought the resources or not. But as a whole, the state we did not have rolling blackouts. As you guys are aware, we had a whole bunch of demand response and then backup generation and imports come in. Do you want to add anything?
I was going to say imports.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the subject that Commissioner Martinez Beltran brought up about the adverse weather. I don't really know a lot about energy, but I do know a lot about water and flood forecasting and that sort of thing. And this decision that you're gonna plan for a 1 in 10 storm, that's an engineering construct that can be changed at any time. And then the other thing is, what 10 years are they planning for? I mean, are they planning for the 10 years that happened between 1960 and 70? Or are they planning for the 10 years that they think are happening now? Or do they put together the worst years and come up with it? I mean, who makes it? Who makes those decisions, and how is that being looked at? Because I mean, we do expect, we all believe that as climate change progresses, our weather is going to get much more variable. Mm-hmm. And so how is this variability being built in to this? I mean, I know what we get is the number, and that's good, but who's behind the number? And how do they do that?
Do you want to try to answer?
Yeah, sure. So the CPUC is responsible for administering the resource adequacy program. So the planning reserve margin is something that they are really focusing on, as we saw in the issues that we saw in September 2022. So is the load forecast the right load forecast? Is 1 in 10 the right measurement? Is 15% a good enough buffer? I can tell you that when we're going through a set of workshops right now to talk about changing these things, And the first thing that they're looking at is the planning reserve margin. So having more resources available is the first step. Looking at load forecasts and saying, is 1 in 10 good enough? That's something that they are very much focusing on. So, you know, we're sort of getting caught off guard in the RA program and making adjustments. And really, there's a lot of people focusing on this right now, trying to get it right.
Well, that's good. Well, I would just add as a sort of a factoid is that in the U.S., we design our flood protection projects for 100-year flood or 1%. In the Netherlands, they design their flood protection projects for 1 in 2,500 years. So, you know, it's just what they've decided that you know, they live by the North Sea, and they really care about that, and they put a lot of resources in it. So it is something that could change, and I think it's just, you know, it's one of the many variables to keep our eyes on.
Good. Next slide, I think. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about what we can do differently going forward, or what we're thinking about. So in order to meet our reliability, clean, and affordability goals, we have to look at every resource, technology, strategy that's available to meet energy capacity, and then sometimes both. And so we've said it over and over, you know, these resources bring different things to the table. For the most part, renewables that we procure through power purchase agreements or even through short-term products only really provide energy. They have a little bit of capacity, a lot if it's geothermal, but mostly just energy, and that's what we buy those for. Same with carbon-free resources. The types of carbon-free resources that we've historically bought and most likely will continue to buy are large hydro and then allocations that we get from PG&E of nuclear. Those don't have capacity with them. Those are only energy resources. We get to count them towards our clean goals, but not towards reliability. Other things that we need to consider are the stuff in kind of in the middle. So, you know, demand response programs, those don't produce energy. Those are measures that we could deploy to essentially shift and modify load to reduce the amount that we need to use during peak hours, right? So we shift them later in the day or earlier in the morning. If you've got 4 electric vehicles you charge, maybe you charge them when demand's not at its highest or something. And then storage is another one. It doesn't provide, storage itself doesn't produce electricity or energy. It's just a capacity product that allows us, again, to shift our resources. And, you know, one thing that SVCE has done to our credit is we have paired every single one of our solar resources, with the exception of one, with storage. And we did it because we believed it provided a good kind of hedge value for us. It allowed us to shift energy into more valuable hours. And we also thought strategically that it would help with reliability, and that actually turned out to be the case. And so we were one of the first CCAs or load-serving entities to deploy that strategy, and now everybody's doing it, and the state is mandating it. So we were early adopters there, and we'll continue to do, you know, storage, whether it's alone or with paired with renewable resources. And then again, as Charles has mentioned and I mentioned as well, we buy a lot of natural gas, but only the capacity. We don't buy any energy currently from natural gas resources. But as we move forward, we need to look at, again, how have we been doing this and what do we need to change? What should the term of those resources be? Maybe we should be buying more long-term resources for capacity only. What is our ability to contract for those types of resources if they're short-term? You know, how available are they in the market? And if we're going to develop new resources like clean resources, again, how much lead time do we need to allow for? Is 3 to 5 years enough? You know, are we going to continue to see supply chain issues and backlogs? Should we be planning for a longer time horizon to bring these on? And then what is kind of the role of natural gas in our portfolio, not just in the form of capacity, but also energy? So one of the things, and Charles is going to talk a little bit about this when we get to more layers of options. One of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of natural gas marketers or owners have had these long-term contracts that are called tolls that combine the energy and the capacity under one contract. those contracts are terminating or ending or whatever, and they're looking to renew them. They don't want to unbundle the resources. They want to sell it as a bundled product because that helps their bottom line and their certainty for planning. So how is that going to play a role in our portfolio, or should it? How are we going to continue to meet our RA program compliance requirements? And how should we combine these resources to ensure that we are more likely or have a better chance of meeting them so that we don't have penalties? We don't like to be in that position of penalties. We want to comply. And then this last one is actually kind of a difficult one to plan around, and how do we build a portfolio around this when we constantly get procurement orders. We do these integrated resource plans. We try to build portfolios that we believe are optimal for us, that balance our requirements for clean energy and capacity against our load, and that bring value to our portfolio. But then the state, for reliability or for whatever reason, institutes procurement orders, and they say, and you should go buy this whether you need it or not. You need it, that's just an order. So how do we factor in those procurement orders? We've had about 15,000 megawatts of procurement already ordered, and our share being somewhere around, about 300 megawatts. And there's a new one in the works as well. How do we plan for those so that we're not in a position where we have too much capacity, too much clean energy, and that we're stranding these resources? Next slide. So here we just kind of talk about some of the procurement that we currently do. Most of this we've already talked about. We buy long-term renewables, we buy short-term resources, we buy storage paired with renewables, mostly solar, for different duration. We actually have some long duration in our portfolio too. That was a procurement mandate, and we brought on we contracted for about 21.5 megawatts of long duration storage. And then we have procured resource adequacy through demand response type programs, but we ourselves have not deployed a demand response resource adequacy product. That's something that's a tool or a product that you can use. You can actually pay someone to not use electricity during certain hours of the day, and that's countable towards your RA requirements. We're going to look at new technologies, new opportunities, new strategies, including looking at longer term resource only contracts like we talked about, looking at different long duration storage technology. The two contracts that we have for long duration storage are both lithium ion. That has its limitations. There's a lot of it, and it's becoming more and more expensive because of supply constraints. So what other technologies should we look at? Should we look at pumped hydro? Some of these new emerging technologies. There's all kinds of opportunities there as well. And then there's these last two opportunities, which again goes back to the question, like, what role should natural gas play in our portfolio in the period while we transition to this clean grid? And I'm going to let Charles explain those two last bullets in a little more detail than what's here.
Sure. Yeah, I think the last two is just to recognize what types of resources are available to SVC. So, there's natural gas resources that have RA capacity and energy. We call them gas tolls. So in a way, it's like leasing a car rather than owning it. You use the car, you put gas in it, it gets you from point A to point B. A natural gas toll is very similar to that. We're not buying the physical property, we're not buying the asset, we're using it. It provides us capacity, it provides us megawatt hours. So that's sort of the way that I think of the gas toll. And then the bottom one is hybridization of natural gas power plants with battery storage and also things like hydrogen. So a lot of these natural gas plants see that writing's on the wall. It's time to change. It's time to adapt to California's future of getting to 2045, 100% clean energy. And so this last one is an interesting concept. We've seen some proposals that look very interesting in how you would effectively take a gas resource, reduce its emissions with battery storage, and sort of competing, you have competing assets. So an energy storage resource competes directly at the point of interconnection with a natural gas plant, thus reducing its emissions. So lots of interesting opportunities, but the last two, it's just to take inventory of what's available to SVC.
Next slide. Do you want me to do this one?
I think this is good.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize what the basic alternatives are, in the first row, which we call current, is RPS through PPAs, some standalone storage, just enough to help balance our large portfolio of solar energy, and then whatever is mandated by the California Public Utility Commission through procurement orders, and then a whole bunch of short-term RA-only products. That's kind of what we do right now. That helps us get to our clean goals, right? Because it's all clean energy it's all clean energy with just some capacity from natural gas, but no energy. But it's not really helping us meet reliability, not in the short term in the context of meeting resource adequacy, or in the long term because it's not sustainable. And from an affordability standpoint, we're seeing that that's also being problematic. It's really hard for these resources to, the price of these resources is becoming more and more expensive. From when we started SVCE to now, the portion of our portfolio that RA contributes has gone from somewhere about 15% to now at about
25-ish.
25 and growing percent. So it's becoming a big portion for a very small kind of contribution for us. As we mentioned, or we can also go the clean route and try to add as much standalone storage as possible to meet our reliability requirements. Again, that meets our clean goals, but it's not likely to be very reliable because we're going to have to pair it with some form of energy because you have to demonstrate that you can also charge the battery. And affordability, we think is going to be very expensive just from what we're seeing in terms of the ability to build these projects in a timely way. And so we don't think that relative to what we currently do is any better. We can also, like I said, just do what we do right now, plus buy some longer-term resource adequacy contracts to kind of stabilize that cost. So we just lock in the price of resource adequacy for a longer period of time. That's definitely a strategy that we're looking at. This is really going to be dependent on what the market offers. So we'll go out, we'll do a solicitation and see what the market is offering for these types of resources. And then as Charles mentioned, the two last options is to consider a natural gas resource with not just capacity, but some level of energy through a toll with or without a battery. And those help us meet reliability and affordability goals, I think, better than the current strategy, but have the impact of adding emissions to our portfolio. They're not expected to be large amounts of emissions, but it's not no emissions. And so we are a 100% clean energy CCA, so that could potentially be problematic. Next slide. So just to kind of summarize the challenges that, or the theme of what we've been bringing to you, and both us and Garish as well, we have this retirement of natural gas power plants that's creating a problem in terms of meeting reliability and not just now, but in the future. We have a heavy reliance on RA-only capacity contracts in the short term, and that's becoming problematic. We need to shift from short-term procurement to more longer-term procurement. The effectiveness of renewable resources to meet reliability is not that great, and we think it's going to get worse because the more and more renewable resources that you bring online, the more solar that you bring on, the more wind, the less effective they become on a marginal basis. So that'll be a challenge. The availability of large hydro and out-of-state resources, both for energy and capacity, is also becoming a challenge. Some of our neighboring states, like Washington, is that a neighboring state? No, Oregon, and some of the other ones, the western states, are developing their own clean energy standards and their own resource adequacy programs. And so we're going to be competing for resources in an already scarce market. Our resources have the ability to leave California, just like their resources have the ability to come into California. Electrification and changing load patterns and how we plan for that, how we forecast for it, how the state forecasts for it, and how we plan for it from a resource adequacy standpoint is going to be problematic as well. Some of the forecasts that we've seen just for SVCE that have come down from the state level, from the California Energy Commission, has us increasing load by about 15% due to electrification. So that's a significant load increase. I've been working here in this field for 30-something years, and I have yet to see anything near like 2% on an annual basis. So a 15% increase in load is significant. How are we going to meet that? Resource adequacy right now is very complicated and challenging, but it's going to get even more complicated and challenging. They're going through a reform process right now. In 2025, we will likely, at least this is what's been proposed, go to what's called a slice of day RA framework, where we're going to have to meet a more granular requirement. So all of this means that our ability to meet our clean and capacity requirements are becoming more and more challenging. And you add on top of all the stuff that's happening locally or here, you also have these big global issues like pandemics and stuff that make it even more complicated. Oh, and then there's the interconnection and transmission issue too, which hopefully is a short-term problem and will be alleviated at some point. So next slide. So what are some of the initiatives that we're looking at SVCE for the near term and hopefully can get us to our longer term goals? We're going to continue to procure clean energy resources. I mean, that's our mandate, that's our directive. We're not shying away from that. So we'll continue to buy RPS resources to meet our clean goals and mandates. Like I mentioned, we're going to explore the availability and pricing of long-term RA-only capacity contracts. We've never gone out for that, so we're going to see what that looks like and what's available. We're going to explore opportunities to procure these hybridized battery, natural gas peakers, toll resources. We want to really understand what that resource looks like, what it does for reliability, what's the impact of emissions on our portfolio, how we might be able to neutralize those emissions, and what types of resources are available in the market. We're going to more actively pursue demand resources and distributed energy resources for reliability. So these are, again, not a whole lot of capacity we're going to get from them relative to what we need, but these are things that we can, this is money, good money that we can spend in our service territory to modify our load and to produce real value. And then last but not least, you know, as Girish mentioned in his CEO report, we have this focus area of looking at, you know, what is the pathway to get to carbon-free 24/7? You know, we need to look at it not just can we get there or when we get there, but how can we get there in a cost-effective, sustainable, and reliable manner. So that's an initiative that we're also looking at, and we're going to look at it in the context of clean and reliability requirements as well. So with that, I think that's the end of our presentation. We're happy to take questions, comments.
Great. Let's start off with Elliot.
Hi, thank you. Recently you made a comment about, I just want to understand this a little bit better, that the more you bring online, the less effective they become. So I was curious, in a nutshell, if you could explain that, hopefully, maybe?
I think we have to tag team this one.
Sure.
But I think there's diminishing returns from certain technologies. And when we got the procurement order, which is called the Midterm Reliability Procurement Order, the state established kind of how much we can count the effectiveness of each megawatt that we procure to meet that obligation. And they set it at what they called the marginal effective load carrying capacity, ELCC. And so they said, if you bring on these megawatts in this period of time, you get this much counting. If you bring them on in this period of time, you get this much less. So they're recognizing that there's diminishing returns for every megawatt that you add over time. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, so under the current construct for RA, we measure different types of technologies as one single value. And so what Monica is referring to as the ELCC, you take a megawatt of wind and you transform that into its effective RA contribution. And so when you start adding lots of solar, for example, on the grid, it becomes less effective at meeting reliability because now you're shifting perhaps the peak demand period into other hours. That's what at the heart of what Monica is mentioning. Yeah.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Great. Director Makachuk?
Thank you. Wow, that was quite a presentation. Couple of things. Girish, I don't know if you talked to Sarah Cody or not, but I don't know if she feels your pain, you feel her pain, but and I'm really pleased that we've got some great people at SVCE that are going to solve this difficult problem. This is a huge challenge. That slide that said challenges was not the best slide, but at least we've got the team that's going to be working on that, so I commend you for that. A number of questions come to mind. Don't have to answer them, but I'm kind of wondering, since I've got electric vehicles, and if we are generating electricity with natural gas, let me say it differently. Is the amount of carbon in gasoline less than the amount of carbon in natural gas powered electricity to run that vehicle on the same sort of distance? I don't know if you have that, but that's a question that I'm very curious about the answer. As I look through what you're looking at, I wrote down risk. I believe the further the storage capacity is from the load, you then have transmission and distribution risks. If the transmission goes out, then even if you've got the storage, now you can't get it to market. And I don't know our grid, how redundant it is, and if they can take parts out of the grid and still have the capacity. And then the other thing, when you're talking about short-term versus long-term, and the CEO can make certain purchases, I'm wondering, if we buy too much capacity in the market, can we turn around and resell that capacity? And is there an opportunity there? So those are a bunch of the things that I was writing down. And I just wanted to raise those. You don't have to answer them now, but those are some of my thoughts.
I can try. I think the first one, that's really not in my wheelhouse, but I think we can get an answer for you. I will have to say that, the time of the day that you charge really makes a difference when you're pulling electricity from the grid. If you're charging during the hours where there's a lot of solar or wind being generated, then the emissions on the grid are very, very low. If you're charging when there is no solar or wind, and it's just a lot of natural gas, then you've got a pretty high emission intensity factor. So the time of the day matters, but in terms of if you pick the best days, or the best hours of the day and compared charging electricity versus a gasoline, I think we could do that math as well, both in a bad hour and a good hour. The risk of siting storage away from load, the further away you have resources, whether storage or power plants from load, you have to build transmission, and building transmission itself is a very risky thing, and then maintaining and having that transmission and making sure that it doesn't create wildfires or anything else is a problem. And of course there are losses. Every time you have to transmit power, there's losses. Siting storage or resources near load is always best, but not optimal, because it's hard. You need space to build these resources. You need interconnection capacity. You need to be able to tie it into the grid, wherever the grid connects. So those are also things that you have to consider when siting resources. And then on the short-term versus long-term, we can only, per our energy risk management policies that the board has approved, they set certain authorities for our CEO. And one of those authorities is that he cannot buy resources that he knowingly knows he doesn't need. That is, he can't, with the intent of reselling it, he can't speculate. But we can buy resources, and we do buy resources that are bundled in a certain quantity or term that we need in order to meet, say, our summer months, and then we don't need them in the fall months. And those we do resell, because we need to buy them in order to meet our obligations. So he does have the ability to sell some stuff, but he doesn't have the ability to go out and buy something he knows he doesn't need for a long period of time, hoping he could sell it and make money. He can't do that. I don't think he can.
I understand that.
Unless I come to the board.
Well, unless you come to the board. Yeah, he can come to the board.
Exactly. Where I was going with that is, I think the risk of the demand for electricity going down is low. So therefore, and I also think the electrification numbers in what that 15% that you mentioned, I think that number is low. And I think that there could be if we procure too much long-term energy, then, capacity, that it's not as risky as we may think. So,
Yeah, we can look at scenarios. That's what we do. With our risk manager, we plan for expected base, what we think our expected load is going to be. But we can certainly do some stress testing and look at some scenarios, like what if our load increased? What if this happened? What if that happened? How would this purchase or strategy look? And we do that. We will do that.
And we do have an answer to your gasoline, natural gas question. Mr. Tony Yulo.
Wow.
Wow.
From Morgan Hill.
Thanks to the DOE and some quick Googling. So the comparison between the embedded carbon in a battery electric vehicle versus a traditional gas vehicle depends on the state and the fuel mix in that state. So in California, we have a relatively clean grid. So an all-electric vehicle is annually expected to emit maybe 1,500 pounds of CO2 based on the emissions from the electricity. Conversely, a gasoline vehicle would be about 12,000. So about 10 times the amount almost in this state. Or 1/10 of the emissions in a battery car versus a gasoline car.
Great. Let's go to Director Klein.
Sure. Thank you very much. Very dense and very dense presentation, but I do think it's critical as we look forward. And I think a lot of it has to do with storage. And you mentioned, let's say, the issues with lithium storage and kind of an unknown as far as capacity and especially aging of those sorts of systems. In passing, you mentioned pumped hydro. You mentioned hydrogen, especially green hydrogen from that standpoint. Are there projects that are out there trying to kind of do that mode shift from for storage that are active right now that we're looking at, that you've heard about?
I'll answer part of it, but I'll have to lean on Charles to answer the hydrogen part of it because I haven't really explored that. But so through CC Power, California Community Power, we issued a joint solicitation back in 2020 for long duration storage, hoping to get enough capacity to meet our procurement requirements through the procurement order, but also capacity. We were hoping to get what we called new emerging technology, so non-lithium ion offers. And we got, I think, quite a bit of different offers for different types of technology: vanadium flow, pumped hydro, gravity, some kind of, I can't say the word, aqueous battery or aqueous battery, whatever that's called. We were very excited about that. A lot of capacity, a lot of interesting technologies. We evaluated them. We saw some that we thought were really kind of interesting, that even though they weren't as cost effective as lithium ion in terms of how they were offered, it was encouraging that we were even willing to support them nonetheless. As a group, collectively, there was 7 or 8 CCAs that came together and said, hey, if we all go in and take a chance on this stuff, maybe we'll spur something, maybe we'll get some other type of technology out there. The challenge we found, though, was that a lot of the developers in that space didn't have the familiarity with how to develop projects in California in the Cal ISO. And so there was an issue there that they just didn't have the chomps to kind of get site control, to get interconnection capacity, to really kind of make this a viable thing. But that said, there have been CCAs, Central Coast Community Energy is one of them, that have invested in some emerging technologies I think they've done some vanadium flow batteries and some gravity-fed batteries. And so we work really closely with them on our power purchase agreements since we share so many. So we're hoping to learn from them as well, see what worked, what didn't work, what was the viability of the proposal, did it pan out at the end of the day? And we're through CC Power. I think the plan is at some point we will go back out to the market collectively again to see if there's some emerging technologies of interest. The state has also provided some funding for emerging technology for long duration storage. So there's a lot of money, or there was a lot of money out there to help fund these things. So those are things that we definitely want. I just have to say that right now we're focused more on meeting our clean and reliability capacity requirements than we are pursuing emerging technology. And with hydrogen, I don't follow that closely. I know, Charles, you follow it a little more just in terms of the viability and what's out there right now.
Yeah, in terms of hydrogen, we've spoken to a couple different, actually natural gas suppliers that are natural gas resource suppliers that are trying to retrofit their plants to use hydrogen. It's just at a conversational level right now. It's you need to look at the natural gas pipeline, see how that can accommodate hydrogen, because if you don't have a pipeline, you're essentially transporting it from some location to your facility, and that may in and of itself create a reliability risk that you don't have currently with natural gas. So a lot of the hydrogen conversations are very preliminary, but I think to get over this hurdle between natural gas and hydrogen, it's going to be changing the pipeline to get that fuel source there. But I think those conversations will be more interesting maybe in a couple of years, but right now they're just sort of preliminary, casual conversations with suppliers.
And I appreciate that. I hear a lot of, I was in DC a few weeks ago, and definitely the Secretary of Energy was really pushing hydrogen in a big way, and that kind of applies to multiple ways, multiple things as far as that's concerned. Since it was 2020 when the CCAs last came together and said, what are we going to do? Could you forward that, before I was on the board, can you forward kind of what the summary of those proposals were?
Yep.
Just for education standpoint and looking at when the CCAs come together to continue that, because I do think that will be critical. I think, the reliance on lithium ion isn't scalable in the long term, and and I think we don't know enough about the long-term capacity loss and how that plays into that also. So, I'd appreciate that.
So we'll definitely do that. We'll send that to you. We're thinking of having kind of like a workshop in April or so, just to get everyone up to speed on all these big initiatives and thinking. There's the CARB scoping plan, which is looking at carbon capture and sequestration. We talked about offshore wind, this pump storage. Yeah, so there's a lot of things. The state's looking out 20 years, and so we'll come back to you in April-May period with the workshop.
Perfect. And I think, what you were talking about earlier, it's the power of the CCAs working together to fund some of these larger programs that conceivably make them viable. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Go ahead, Director Mekachek.
You just triggered a thought. It's an additional demand for energy, and that's when people speak to desalination of water. And there's some zeros behind that, I'm afraid.
Let me go ahead with the question. Oh, go ahead, Director Martinez-Beltran.
Thank you, Chair. Andrea, could you go back to that last slide, please, for me? And just in the meantime, I really appreciate the comments from Director Klein. Thank you for offering that workshop. Grish, I think that's a great idea. And I mean, these are, as Grish was telling us earlier, these are incredible issues of our time. And I think this is important for us to note that this is why we put the flexibility and the competitive HR policies to secure and keep the talent that we have because it's important that we have that longevity that continues to go on. So I want to thank you for that. I mean, I don't think anybody envies the position that you're in. I've seen what this group has done before my time, and I have no doubt that we'll do it again. I love the point that Director Matichak made about the long term, and I'm sure you've looked at that and the availability to maybe resell. So, you know, looking forward to that. I just wonder if this last point, I mean, are we to consider the reality of going to, of not having carbon free in our wheelhouse to some point?
It's a very good question, and actually,
I feel like it's really kind of the issue we need to
yeah,
discuss.
you know, the definition of carbon-free is, and how we measure, that's going to change. Today, we call ourselves carbon-free by balancing on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm.
But we know at this time of the night, natural gas power plants are running right now. So we can't just say, oh, we don't want that. So what we tend to do is we just buy these renewable energy credits in the same quantity as we buy this grid electricity. We are going to move to a more granular kind of measurement, and that will almost certainly change how much emissions get attributed to each load-serving entity. And that is a more accurate and realistic way of doing it. So again, I'm taking the long view of like, let's put infrastructure in the ground that's clean.
Mm-hmm.
And how the regulations change on measuring, that's going to change. And you know, I kind of previewed this a little bit in my CEO report, saying there's a technicality that's going to change how our emissions get reported. We're actually buying power from a geothermal plant, but the way the local air quality district attributes emissions on that particular plant, even though it's a renewable plant and gets 100% credit for being a renewable plant, there are emissions attributed to that. And so that just gets onto our report card. So that's just an example of how that specific regulation attributes it. So I think your strategic question of should we look at something where we may have some emissions, I think it's a balance of, you know, how much clean energy and cost and reliability. So I think in the long run, we are going to carbon neutrality. There's no doubt about that. I think over here, like some of the alternatives that Charles presented, if you go to a long-term gas unit for capacity, but maybe you also add the ability to take some gas energy from that, some energy that's generated from natural gas, yeah, we won't be 100% carbon-free at that point. But we probably save money because, and so that's the policy trade-off that the board has to struggle with.
Right.
And that's kind of, in a way, this presentation is a grounding in the reality of the physical system, while at the same time saying we are going to be 100% clean.
How are we going to get there?
How are we going to get there? And in this interim period, this gas fleet will get reduced over the next 20 years, but right now it exists, and to comply, we have to buy that capacity. It's just, do we buy it short term, which is what the authority I have right now? Or do we take a portfolio approach and say, well, let's buy some short term, continue, and let's buy some long term. Maybe some of that long term capacity could be associated with an option to buy energy. So that's what we are evaluating. We're talking to a number of suppliers about this.
Okay.
And it's not just us who are thinking about this, right? I guess that gets to Director Mekichik's point too, about others are looking at load increasing. Where's this capacity going to come from? So that is something we should look at.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Great. If you could leave this presentation up. Oops, I was too slow. not sure who to direct this at, but it kind of to tie in some of these thoughts as we continue to acquire and procure over the next time period. You also mentioned the competition with the Pacific Northwest as they come up with their own regulations. And how do we become a preferred, more powerful buyer? Is it our balance sheet? Is it our credit rating? How do we do that?
Okay, I think we're gonna have to approach this two different ways. I don't think it's us is the problem, us being SVCE. We are a credit-worthy counterparty. All the marketers like us. They're all listening, by the way. Why aren't you? It's more the rules that California has put in place for resource adequacy for electricity or capacity that's imported from out of state have made it very onerous and not attractive for marketers to sell into California resource adequacy. And so that's part of the problem. It's not because they don't like us, it's because the PUC has put in place some very onerous rules.
I may just add to what Monica said. So this whole transition into a clean grid, we started it in like that 2005-ish period when Assemblymember Byron Scher introduced the first renewables bill, and then Senator Smidian got another bill which increased that. And so now we're moving to, and then there were these rules around renewables which said, for example, hydroelectric is not renewable. That was a state regulation. Mm-hmm. If you buy renewable power from out of the state, that doesn't count. That was okay for then. I think there's a fundamental issue when we are looking at this global problem of reducing emissions and maintaining reliability and affordability. I do believe that some constraints have to be relaxed. And one of them is our grid needs to be looking at a much wider geographic area. And this is a concept called regionalization. We should be looking at getting resources from all of the Western United States. Now, it's not a new idea. This idea has been proposed several years ago, and it did not go forward. It was fought. We had environmental organizations on both sides of it. We had organized labor on one side wanting to keep all the renewables within California, because then it's labor jobs within California. But I think things have changed where we have reliability issues. The climate crisis is of such import that we really need to look at this again. And coincidentally, just today, Assemblymember Holden has introduced a bill around regionalization. And so we're just in the process of reviewing that bill. But that's, like Monica said, we're too small to be a preferred buyer. We met the minimum threshold of investment grade. We have good reserves, so we're good. Okay. But fundamentally, getting more supply, clean supply into the system, we need to change the way these regulations are managed.
Thank you. I don't see any other comments. How about from, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the fees thing is what, getting hit with fees is the thing that is kind of top of my mind, because to me that's just like throwing money down the drain that could be invested in, any of our goals, future projects and whatnot. So me personally, I feel like we should definitely, even though, we obviously want to avoid all that dirtiness, fossil fuels as much as possible, but I feel like every time we get hit with these fees, it's just, such a waste. And so I feel like if we can do in the short term, some kind of compromise, and yes, we are going to have to invest for the capacity, et cetera, in some of these fossil fuels. I think that it's just a better option, in my opinion, than just continuously getting hit with fee after fee after fee that adds up to millions and millions of dollars. I'm very curious to know how everyone else feels up here about that.
All right, any other comments? I would say I hate penalties as much as the next person. It is a question of balancing.
Picking up on what Director Elliott said, it looks like everyone is going through the same problems, right? Everyone has a penalty. Are there any organizations which don't have this penalty imposed on them because they have adequate capacity? Or?
We don't know yet. I think there may be some. Some small ones will probably get through. We're rather large, but I don't know. None of this is not public yet.
And it will get public at some point?
Correct. Yeah.
Because it seems like if everyone is having the same problem and everyone gets a penalty imposed, what's the point of it? Someone somewhere needs to make a decision that maybe the goals are too unreachable.
Just unreasonable or rigid.
Yeah.
My sense of it is not everyone has, so I think some may have over-purchased more than what their needs were.
Is that like hoarding?
You can say they've put a higher safety buffer in their internal planning.
Which is another cost. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So we have actually made filings talking about transparency in many of these trades. I'd say this is a problem that number of CCAs, I told you, at least 10 are going to suffer from. I don't know about the investor-owned utilities, whether they are short or not.
And the other thing we heard was these penalties, we don't know where the money goes.
Well, we do know it's going to the general fund.
Oh, it does go to the general fund, okay.
Correct. The state general fund.
Okay, I don't see any other. I'm going to take it to the public. Do we have any public comment on this? Mr. Harney, please come forward.
Hi, Bruce Carney from Mountain View. As the chair of Carbon Free Mountain View, you might expect that I would say some things like, well, we have to stay carbon free. But honestly, when we decided what our name was, we had no idea what kind of complexity would be showing up 7 years down the road. So what I want to stay and said is, my first point is that you have a wonderful staff here who will navigate these rocky rapids as well as anyone can possibly navigate them. And to add a little bit of data to that point, every year I produce a report called How Green, How Cheap that compares the cost and greenness of all the CCAs in Northern California against each other and against PG&E and against the California grid as a whole. You might think that all CCAs produce electricity with lower GHG emissions than PG&E, but you would be wrong. There are only 4 CCAs that are greener than PG&E currently is, and those are PCE, SVCE, Clean Power SF in San Francisco, and MCE, formerly known as Marin Clean Energy. All the other CCAs are dirtier than PG&E, and in many cases by a lot. And so the ability to do as well as SVCE has done over the last 5 or 6 years is actually quite rare. And to the extent that it's getting rarer, that is a shame. And as we've heard, it's a consequence of changes to policy. So in past years, before some of you were on the board, staff were talking about a concept called the virtual power plant. And I would love it if they could talk a little bit more about that concept and how it applies to today's issues. But one of the things that strikes me is that a lot of people I know are buying battery storage systems for their homes. And the reason in general is not to arbitrage power prices or to support the grid on the hottest days of the summer. It's to prevent the inconvenience of blackouts, which in California typically happen in the winter. So a battery on a home, or perhaps at a business, can provide 2 sources of value. To the homeowner, in the winter, it keeps the lights on if the storm knocks down the feeder into their home. But in the summer, it could provide some level of grid support on that September 6th super hot afternoon. And if SVCE were perhaps a co-funder
and sometime operator of that battery, which is perhaps part of the virtual power plant concept, then the proverbial two birds could be killed with one battery stone. The other thing that I would like to say is that when we get to the lovely future of 2045, when everything is all clean and electric, one of the hardest times of the year to deal with is actually going to be winter nights. And another hard time to deal with is summer afternoons. Building insulation and better windows can help reduce electricity demand at both of those times. And so if what's driving the 15% adequacy reserve is peak demand, then better insulation, better windows can reduce the peak demand on which the 15% is based, as can all sorts of other programs, pricing programs and things that help businesses, which are the most of the load for this utility, and homeowners, lower their demand at the time when that demand is the most painfully expensive for SVCE to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carney. Some good points. Do we have any other public comments? I do not see any. So thank you. Thank you, staff, for quite a presentation. Gave us all a lot to think about. Certainly, I think we all learned something. Can't deny that. So with that, I say we're complete with item number 5, and now I'm ready to move on to board member announcements and directions on future agenda items. Do we have any suggested announcements or future items? I do not see any at the dais here, and I don't see anyone from Sally. And so with that, I will say we're ready to, where's my gavel? Adjourn.